For some context, I'm a 28-year-old male. There was a girl at my work who was 30 years old. On one particular night, we decided to go out on a date. We went out to this fundraiser. We had fun and we were drinking quite a bit. Later on, she invited me back to her place, and of course I accepted. We sat in her living room and we talked over beer. It was a nice conversation. Nothing weird or anything. Mainly we talked about people we didn't like from work and what happened the night previously. She asked if I wanted to go upstairs and I agreed. She told me to have a seat on her bed while she got ready in the bathroom. I honestly hadn't processed this information when I was going over to her bed, but it became clear as day when I sat down. The only light in her room was on her bedside lamp. As I'm scanning the room, I'm visibly confused. There was not a single room decoration that wasn't clown-themed. And I'm not talking goofy-looking clowns. I'm talking about scary Pennywise stuff. The ones that I took notice of were as follows. A clown portrait on the wall near her bed wearing a suit and a menacing grin. A picture of a clown playing golf. 2 statues on each side of her bed that had clowns looking directly at us. A female clown poster giving a waving motion that looked like its eyes were following me. Several hand-drawn pictures of clowns, some on the walls, some in frames, and probably what was the most disturbing to me was a very demonic-looking clown portrait that faced the bed. Since my childhood, I've always had an intense fear of clowns. I couldn't see how anyone could feel comfortable sleeping in a room like this, or even be living in a home where a room like this existed. This absolutely destroyed my anxiety. And the next thing I know, the door creaks open, and standing in the doorframe is the same person wearing a full clown suit, clown makeup, and everything. She's holding an axe in her hand, and she says, "Ready for some fun?" I bolted the absolute crap out of there. I don't know if it was a game, I don't know if she was messing around, but I didn't want to find out. The creepiest part is I later found out that was her last day at work. This happened about 2 years ago when I tried to get into the dating scene using Hinge after my first relationship ended. The guy's name was Dan, and he was one of my first matches on the app. Everything was going smooth. He seemed nice and goal-oriented. But after about 2 weeks of talking, we decided to finally meet up. At the time, I didn't have my driver's license or a car, so my brother had to drive me down to the meeting spot. Dan took me to a little airport cafe since it's right next to our basic 3-seated plane airport. He began talking about his ex and how she was pregnant. He went into detail about all the hospital fees he had to pay, thinking it was his kid until the baby was born. She had cheated on him, and based on the very different skin color of the baby, it was obvious it couldn't be his. Dan then began to talk about his mother who had some problems as she liked to tase her kids, including him, and watch them seize up. He told me he had health problems from this. Then he began talking about getting a pilot's license and how he always wanted to propose to someone in a plane. The literal next thing he said was, "So have you ever been up in one of those little planes?" with a wink. He then continued to say that he was in a midlife crisis, and I'd given him a reason to live. After we ate, we left. The date continued as Dan said there was nothing to do in my town, and he wanted to drive 2 hours to the next big one, where there was more stuff to do. I declined, and he changed his intent with actually wanting to see a friend down there. I told him I'd be okay with being dropped off at the local store, and he could go by himself. He got really mad and upset, and proceeded to turn around and head back into town. Then Dan pulled over to the side of the street with many houses, and asked if I'd like to practice driving. I of course said no, because I hadn't even read the little book the DMV gives out, and his car was one of those really expensive Mustangs. I wasn't going to crash it. Then he pouted. He said he needed gas, and then we went to a gas station. When we got to the gas station, he asked about my previous relationships. I said it wasn't something I'd talk about to someone so new, and I clarified it wasn't a good one. This seemed like the perfect opportunity to leave, because even though it was just a gas station with only pumps, I could easily walk into the store and call my brother. But of course, Kyle wouldn't have it. He locked me in his car. I got frantic trying to find the lock to pull or push at, but there weren't any. He said he only had locks on his side of the car. and he wanted to know about my ex. I began to have an anxiety attack and scratching my hand, hyperventilating and crying. He simply sat there and watched me do it, without saying a single word. After about an hour, I could finally breathe calmly and told him my ex was a friend I had known for about 9 years. Then after the relationship started, he became abusive. He simply responded with okay, and let me out. I called my brother within a few minutes and he didn't pick up, and I wanted to go home so bad. I wasn't thinking straight, so I agreed to let Dad drive me home, with a plan to get dropped off near a neighbor's house, because I didn't want him to know where my parents lived. After he dropped me off, he messaged me on the app about how I ruined the date and made it awkward, and that I was weird. I confronted him about how uncomfortable and scared he made me feel, to which he responded with an okay, and unmatched me. I then deleted the app and didn't re-download it for another 6 months to try again. But it was the most terrifying day of my life. I just hope I never meet Dan again. I'll preface by saying I don't normally go on many dates, but when I do, I make sure I follow safety protocol all the time. I only meet in public date places. I let either family or friends know where I'm going, and I park in a populated place close to wherever we meet. This date initially suggested we should meet at his house and watch a movie and have a few drinks, and I said no. I do not feel comfortable with that, and I only want to meet in public. He seemed okay with this, but then brought it up a few more times, and I said if money was an issue, we could meet up another time, or forget about it altogether. But my date backtracked and went with my idea of meeting at a cafe that I chose. I was familiar with it, and it was of equal distance to where we both lived. He eventually turns up in a two-door car. This detail is very relevant, and he goes into the cafe and I follow behind him and introduce myself. After a polite introduction, things begin to get weird. I order a Coke and he says, "Don't you want a drink?" I was going to pop into a bar, which is connected to the cafe, and get one. I say no, I'm not drinking, and he looks at me like, what the F? As if I'm being unreasonable. I already explained to him in messages I'm not drinking as I'm on medication, so having to re-explain it again got me really mad. He seems so disappointed and goes to order a cider from the bar while I get a table. We sit down with our drinks and he immediately goes on about how I should come back to his place again, even though the original plan was to stay here and order food, and I already stated that it was not going to happen. He says something along the lines of having a few drinks and eating at his place, and I said we don't have to eat, we can just have our drinks here and leave. He got really defensive and says he has money, but prefers we go back to his place. I make a joke and say, "You're not a killer, are you?" And instead of laughing it off, he stares at me uncannily and says, "You don't think I would hurt you, do you?" I laugh uncomfortably and say, "Of course not," but really I'm relieved this date won't be going any further. The date suddenly says, "Are you going to follow me in your car? Because that wouldn't make sense. How about we go in my car? But I've got packages in the front, so you'll have to squeeze in the back, and I'll drop you back off to your car later." In reality, that made less sense than me following him in my own car and then driving home from his house after. The fact it was completely illogical made it even more creepy in my mind. Every alarm bell was going off at this point. I said, "Look, I don't want to go to yours, and your constant insistence is giving me the creeps." The date looked absolutely shocked. He then mumbles something about needing to go to the bathroom. He then excuses himself from the table. A few moments later, I see him through the cafe window getting into his car and driving off. Massive bullet dodged in my opinion. Also, the fact that his car didn't have any back doors made it even more sinister, because imagine if something happened in the car and I couldn't escape. I don't know what his intentions were, but they certainly weren't good. I matched with this guy on Hinge a while back and thought he was cute. He was a real southern gentleman and he seemed overall very respectful. We had a good conversation and I thought it was going very well. So when he asked me to finally go on a date, I didn't even hesitate. He told me that he was a chef and worked at an upscale restaurant in the area. For our date, he wanted to have me come to his restaurant and he would cook for me. How romantic, right? Of course I said yes. The next day I drove to the restaurant that was tucked away in a rural area. I thought it was in a gorgeous area and I wasn't thinking about how truly secluded it really was. I pull up to the restaurant and I noticed something was off. There were no cars in the parking lot. I tried to stay calm and give him the benefit of the doubt, but it was suspicious. I see his car and I pull up next to him. roll down my window and ask, "Hey, where is everyone? Is the restaurant closed?" He then rolls down his window and says, "Oh no, the restaurant is closed. There was an emergency. But hey, we can go get some pizza at my place. I live like right down the road." I was hesitant at first. The red flag signal was going off in my head. I uttered, "I think I might go home then." He then got out of his car and got into mine. I froze with fear and thought to myself, well, this will not end well. He then starts insisting we go back to his place and wasn't taking no for an answer. For some background, I work as a therapist and I work with loads of violent patients. I've learned that running away immediately scares them, and they are more likely to attack that way. Knowing this, I knew I needed to be strategic in order to get out of the situation unscathed. I was able to text my friend saying, "Call me in 10 minutes. If I don't pick up, call 911. I told him I had to get a text from work, and I just needed to respond real quick. He never noticed. We drove literally 2 minutes down the road to a very seedy motel. He then took the wheel and forced me to turn in and park. My voice was in shock when I asked, "What are we doing here?" To which he responded with, "I live here." I started sweating. He got out of the car, walked over to me and pulled me out and started forcing me inside. I knew I couldn't run at this point because my foot was broken, and I was in one of those silly little boots. We get into the motel room and it's an absolute horror show in there. It's filthy, food everywhere, clothes scattered around, and it smelled so bad. The next thing I knew, he pushed me onto the ground. I was thinking I was going to be the next investigation discovery at this point, because I'm pretty sure he was going to murder me. I tried to push him off when my phone rang. It was my friend. He was startled by the call, long enough for me to kick him in the face with my metal boot and hobble out of there as fast as I could. I was able to get away, thankfully. I'm very cautious now with dating, and I try to vet them as much as possible, because you never know who you might meet.